So, hello everyone. My name is Harry. It's good to see some familiar faces in the front over here. Someone from Devon, yeah. I'm new to VMUG and this is my first presentation. So, I'm here to talk about something that I'm very passionate about. And it's good to see that the first two sessions already talked about, time and how do we make things more progress in terms of getting digitalized and automation, etc. So Ansible is one of those tools that you can use in infrastructure as code to kind of help you focus on areas rather than clicking UIs and drop-down menus and clicking next, etc. Because I'm sure you've all been there deploying something and it can get really annoying when it's repetitive. Oh. I think the clicker is working. So about me, my name is Harry. I'm a senior consultant at Extrovert for coming up to 2 years now. I predominantly focus in areas of networking security and cloud providers stack. These are kind of the areas of expertise that I've got in and some certificates. Things about myself, well, I love food. As you can tell, I love food. I love spicy foods, things that make me cry because I'm Sri Lankan. I love to travel and recently become a dad, so to a 7-year-old baby boy, and he's been keeping me busy, so family is important, and last of all, home labs. So with home labs, again, Ansible plays a major part in it where it helps me automate a lot. So a quick agenda. I've got to give a quick overview of Ansible. What is infrastructure as a code? What is Ansible? And what are the benefits and the main features of it? Now, there are a lot of materials and courses out there that you can learn for Ansible and understand it. So I'm trying to focus more on the demos. The main purpose of this is to show you how Ansible can really help you progress with your automation deployments with your VMware estate, because a lot of people have come to me, I went on this course for Ansible, or I read some articles, but how do I actually apply that to VMware? How do I get that to deploy something that I need and then to configure, etc.? So I have some examples that I'm going to show, and that's what I'm going to mainly focusing on, such as deployment, the configuring, and like creating NSXT objects. So what is infrastructure as a code? Infrastructure as a code is basically when a user or a person would create some code and then version control it using something called Git or something similar. Now, version control is really important because when you create code, you want it to be approved and then to be stored somewhere safe, to then be able to use the same code again, to then push it out to do a thing that you want. So that scripts, that code that you create will be passed on to an automation provisioning tool, which then can target either any infrastructure in the cloud up there or infrastructure on premises, okay? To sum it. So this provides you with consistency, repeatable and scalable and version controlled. So what is Ansible? Ansible is that automation tool that I showed you earlier. It helps you automate the tasks and achieve the desired state in the system. So a user will create a playbook and use a CLI, or nowadays user interfaces are available, to then target the Ansible engine, which is built of a lot of open source modules that are created by people, which I'll get into, and it's Python code-based, but you can use other languages. And what it will then do, it will target the endpoints, as I mentioned earlier, with the public cloud and the private clouds, the on-premises. And you can see with these columns over here, we've got a lot of infrastructure devices, such as Linux, OpenShift, VMware, containers, network devices, such as Cisco, F5, security cloud, and it goes on. So Ansible can actually target quite a few range of devices, and it's very flexible in that sense. So Ansible, the nutshell. So again, I'm going to go a very high overview of Ansible, plenty of material online. So Ansible uses playbooks, okay? Playbooks are files that plays the Ansible with execute. So a playbook is a file. On the file, you'll have a set of, what would you call, instructions that goes from top to bottom. So when it gets executed, the playbook will start with step 1, step 2, step 3, step 4, for example. That's basically a playbook. And that will target an inventory that you provide. An inventory is a list of hosts, nodes, your endpoints, such as your Cisco switch. In our case, we're going to talk about the vCenter, NSX, AVI, or ALB, as Ricardo mentioned, and tasks. So tasks are basically within a playbook. That is the action. That is the action that you're defining. Modules are basically within the task. You're using a module to execute what you want. These modules are created by people who've done the heavy lifting for you, right? They've created the modules using lines of code. It could be Python-based, it could be PowerShell-based, it could be anything, right? And API nowadays is very common. As you can see with AVI, API plays a big part. So they've done the heavy lifting, and all you have to do is pass in a few parameters to the module to then to action the task. Roles can be a group of tasks. So you created a playbook with 5 tasks. You then figure out that, these tasks can be used for another playbook and for another playbook. So you don't want to be repeating that same block every single time. So you can literally create a role and then reuse that role for other playbooks rather than having the same tasks defined everywhere. Ansible communicates to your endpoints via SSH if it's Linux-based or WinRM for Windows-based, okay? But nowadays with API more available, you can do a lot with API. So if the vendor of the particular product has made API framework available for the task that you want to action, you can fully take use of it. Over here on the right-hand side, I know it's a bit small, so excuse me, but we have what would you call a structure in Ansible of how you would lay out your files. So at the top, you will have a folder called the inventory. Within the inventory folder, you will have files, YAML files. These files will then contain the hosts, right? So for example, you can have an ESXi host name in there. You can have all your vCenters, all your NSX managers, etc. And even just Windows VMs, etc. in there. The next folder along is called group vars. Group vars are basically contains files that have variables within them. Now, within the inventories, which I'll get onto, you can define that these section of ESXi hosts belong to a group called ESXi group. Okay? So what you then can do, within the group vars folder, you can have that ESXi group file and define a bunch of variables that are related to that whole group. Common variables, right? Let's say, for example, ESXi is version 7.0 U3, okay? This ESXi uses this particular image. These are common between all different hosts, let's put it that way. Then you've got host variables folder. Within there, if you want to specify particular variables for that particular host, such as the host name, the IP, the network adapters, the VMKs, the VM kernels, you can mention it in there. Okay, we've got we've got and the other folders called the library, modules, filter plugins. This is the location that if you find that there are no modules or plugins that are available for you online that you could utilize, made by other people in the community, you can then go off and create your own. You can be adventurous and create your own, and that's probably where you want to dump them. We have the roles folder, and as what I mentioned earlier, is to have those repeatable tasks be placed within so that you can reference these roles. So within a roles folder, you'll tend to have a main.yaml file, and that is the file that will definitely be called upon first when you call the role. and then they have other YAML files in that folder. So the main.yaml then can call upon if you have a subtask you want to call. Within the roles folder, you would also have templates folder. The templates folders are, for example, they're Jinja 2 based. Jinja 2 is a very flashy kind of a new way that Python allows you to dynamically create files. What would you want to dynamically create? Maybe kickstart files, right? Because I'm very lazy on manually deploying my ESXi host or etc. Or my Linux VMs or Windows VMs. I want to create a kickstart file that is dynamic to the device that I'm deploying. We also have the files folder, which are files that part of the execution you want to transfer. Like, for example, you have a root certificate that you want to place onto your nodes so that it can trust your infrastructure, for example. You want to transfer that across. You can also have scripts, such as bash scripts, shell scripts, PowerShell scripts that you want to use to execute on your endpoint. So as that role is called role 1. You can have other roles. Like, for example, I have a role here is called deploy vCSA, which is deploying a vCenter. They've got another role called configuring vCenter, vCSA, and another role for deploy NSXT. And I'll also show you in the demos, they'll have their own kind of tasks within. All right. Again, back to the parent directory in the parent directory, you'll have playbook files. And this is playbooks can, as I mentioned earlier, have tasks explicitly mentioned. It can have roles mentioned. Playbooks can also call upon other playbooks. So if you feel like a playbook can be reused as well, you can also do that. What you want to do is try and, the whole point of roles and including other playbooks, the main idea is so that you have code that are not duplicated. Because if you find that you need to amend that code for any particular reason, you don't want to be searching for it everywhere. You want it to be reusable. So what are the benefits of Ansible? Well, it's very easy to learn. I'm not going to lie. I've not been doing Ansible for so long now, but it is so easy to learn. It was easy to pick up. I've not had a programming background. I was not a developer. I simply was playing with vSphere, and I just got fed up of doing things manually, and I wanted to automate. So picking up Ansible was very easy. It's based on human-readable YAML syntax. So over here on the right-hand side is an example. I've got a task here, task name. It's create NSXT overlay segment, which for those who are not familiar with NSX, it is basically create a network within VMware NSX. I am delegating it to localhost, so you can pretty much understand what it's doing there. So that means the task is running locally rather than remotely. Over here, I've got VMware.Ansible for NSXT.NSX policy segment. That is the name of the module that I'm using. And within the module, you can see the indentation. I've got the perimeters, so it's to the right a little bit. And then within the perimeters, I'm saying I am targeting my NSXT hostname, the username admin, my super secure password. I'm not validating my certs because I haven't done the certs on the NSX. The display name of the network I'm going to create, description, the transport zone is going to be part of, the replication mode, I want it to be up as an admin state. The state is present, so it could be state absent. If it's state absent, that means it will delete the segment. If it's present, if it's there, yeah. And then the tier 1 that it's going to be connected to. So simply, if I were to give this to someone, especially to peer review, when it's going into the GitHub, for example, or Git, they'll be able to actually read this without even seeing it being run if they have a fair understanding of the product of NSX. So if I was able to give this to someone from the NSX team that does not know Ansible, they should be able to understand exactly what this segment is going to be attached to, what it's going to be called. So once it's created, how is it going to look like? So I mentioned YAML, and that is supposed to be easy, right? So in YAML, you've got a few things. Strings, numbers, booleans, lists, dictionaries. So now for those who are familiar with programming in general, such as Python, PowerShell, JavaScript, you name it, this is quite common. You'll be able to understand it, but for those who don't, I want to give you a quick example. So on the right here, I've got a massive extract. I've got something called networks, and you can, networks. Within networks is a dictionary. So a dictionary is a collection of data values of key value pairs, right? So networks has subnets and VMKs, which is VM kernels short form. To access those particular variables, you will do networks.subnets, networks.vmks, okay? As you can see over here, I've got networks and subnets and VMKs. And you can see this by the indentations, hence why I've done the colored lines, okay? You have also lists. So an example of a list is VMNICs. So this particular subnet or port group it's got to be part of VMNIC 0 and VMNIC 1. That's a list. And this is denoted by the dash next to the values. To access those variables, you would use VMNICs and the square brackets 0 or the square brackets 1, for example, to get the whatever you need. You've also got list of dictionaries, okay? So a list of dictionaries example is the subnets section over here. So the subnets have two dictionaries within it. It's got Lab 1 management port group and Lab 1 storage port group. It's a dictionary because it has name, gateway, CIDR, netmask, network, VLAN, trunk, vdswitch, VMNICs. So to access those variables, you would do similar to how you would access a list. So you would do subnets for the square bracket 0, and then a .name to get the name. This is very important to understand because when it comes to creating your work, your playbooks, etc., and your tasks, getting information to then use the information to do the next task is very important. Because these people done a lot of work of creating these modules, which are doing API calls in the back end or using the Python SDK, etc. But it's down to you and how you use that module. So moving on to the Ansible inventory. So within the inventory, I mentioned that this is where you have your hosts defined, your groups of hosts you define. What I have done here, I have included the variables into one flat file. Now, it's down to you, your personal preferences, etc. This works for me in my kind of scenario this is part of my home lab creation, for example. I've got a flat inventory file with all the host and the variables within. So let's have a look here. So I've got a group called Lab 1 vCenter. I've got another group called Lab 1 ESXi compute hosts. Within that group, I've got one vCenter with the host name mentioned, and one host, ESXi. Indented in is because the host has got a dictionary. The host has got to manage clusters. The vCenter manages the cluster ESXi compute hosts. Credentials, these are the credentials, and SSO domain. Whatever you define over here is up to you, but I found it useful to include this information in, and I'll show you why. So for my compute hosts, I've got cluster name, credentials, root, ESXi name, network adapters. I find that these are exclusively important for this particular host, right? Because if I have another host, the information such as the network adapters would be different because they will have different IPs, for example. So what about the variables that are common, right? So we've got a group called all, right? Within all, we've got children of Lab 1, and Lab 1 has children of Lab 1 vCenter and Lab 1 ESXi compute hosts. Okay, so now I'm grouping those two groups up here into my Lab 1 environment. And in line with the definition of the children for lab 1, we've got variables. I've got such as pod name is pod lab 1, data center belongs to lab 1, the time zones, the time 1, time 2, and so on. The list can go on and on. So my actual inventory file is 1,000 line long, so you can see how you can go nuts, you can go crazy, you can put whatever you want in it. You just got to be able to understand whether some variables are worth grouping into groups because you don't want to keep repeating the same thing for each host. So to recap over here, we've got, you can either do it in YAML, this is the YAML format. There are other different methods of INI and JSON. When you're using an inventory, you'll use the -i flag when you're running Ansible. You can group, groups are done logically by a function or a platform. In my case, I've grouped it by ESXi host and vCenter. And you can add variables and dynamic inventory. So I mentioned that my inventory file for my lab is 1,000 lines long, right? That is very hard to create manually. It's a lot. So what you can do is, if you have a CMDB, for example, that's a single source of truth, you can create scripts that would read your CMDB that will dynamically create your Ansible inventory file. Yes, it's a bit of a work, but it then allows you not to hard code a lot of values manually. And the problem you've got there is, which is the source of truth? Is your inventory the source of truth? Is your CMD the source of truth? So if you've got a CMDB and it's not an Excel spreadsheet, which I know a lot of people use, it's worth it to create the inventories dynamically. Modules. So as you can see, I've purposely got in a smaller font because there are a lot, and I can't fit them on this slide. There are a lot of modules created by the community, by the vendors. It's all available at docs.ansible.com, and you can go and just have a look and see whether there's one that you need. Google's your best friend as well. Ginger 2 templating. I want to quickly touch about this. I mentioned earlier about creating kickstart files. You can create them dynamically, right? So for me, I'm not using a kickstart as an example, but part of my lab deployment at home that I use, I create routers, right? Routers for each lab deployment so that I can do my NSX peering. Now, I want to dynamically decide on what the networks that I want to attach to my router. Okay, I don't want to be creating this VIOS router file or configuration each time because I'm lazy. So what you can do is do for loops. So people know what the logic thing is for every subnet within network subnets, do this. If it has this name in the subnet name, do this. Else, do that. And then you end. It's basically if else, if that, for example. So the possibilities are endless, and there you have a dynamic file. You can also use Ginger in your variables to make things even more complicated. It's a lot for this session, but I thought I wanted to show you this so that you know that the possibilities are endless. For example, I don't want to define my, as you saw earlier in the previous slides, in the network adapters, I only specify the IP, not the subnet, not the net mask. So when I'm deploying something, I need to know those variables. So I rather put my subnets, my networks, under my lab variables over here. So I need to do some kind of loops and for loops to do some matching to try and extract that information out when it comes to my actual deployment. Hence the complexity over here at the bottom. I will be having this slide deck published online so that you can actually take your time and look at it in detail. How do I get started? Well, with Ansible, you need a Linux distro. You need to have some dependencies, such for the Ansible. You need Python SDK PyVomi to interact with VMware. You need Ansible collections, which has the roles such as VMware NSXT, NSXALB. If you want to use PowerShell, you can get PowerShell for Linux, PowerShell modules for VMware. It goes on. You've got to start building it manually. This will be published. I'm putting a blog out this very shortly on how to use my container. So I have got a container which has all the dependencies, all the collections, the PowerShell for Linux, etc. within it. So if you have a Windows machine or a laptop or anything like that, you can just run the container and get started straight away. Obviously, it's not tested for production, so part of my blog will be how to create that container so that you can build security around it and version control. Okay, moving on to one of my demos. So the first demo is deploying VMware appliances. Okay, so I have here, let me just get rid of this for the moment, my VS Code environment. Okay, I've got my VS Code here. Here, what I've done, I'm going to give you an example of one out of part 3. So here I've basically got the module VMware Deploy OVF. VMware Deploy OVF module is amazing when it comes to deploying all the appliances that you need, okay? Because as long as you know the OVF properties of your OVA file, such for vCenter, NSX, ALB, and the list that goes on, you can deploy it in one task, okay? So over here you can see that I'm targeting my vCenter. I'm giving in my username and the familiar password that everyone knows. I am saying what the name of my VM is going to be, the folder is going to locate in, the data store. I'll just do that. There we go. I am doing thin provisioning, the networks, the port group that is going to be part of, the OVA that I'm going to use for NSX. I want it to power on straight away. The deployment type is small, and etc., etc. And then the properties section of the properties that if you were to deploy an OVA manually in vCenter, when you right-click and deploy from OVF, it will have a form. That form you fill out, right? So it's exactly the same, but it's just here in code. You don't have to go next. You don't have to click down drop-down menus. You don't have to select which data store that you need. Everything is captured in this one block, as over here. So let's see whether the demo gods are on my side, and I will try and deploy. And I want to show you over here in my lab that I haven't got this NSX VM in here, okay? So I don't know if you can see this. So basically what I'm doing to execute an Ansible playbook, you will do Ansible-playbook, and you can specify the playbook. And this is an example where I'm not using an inventory. I am specifically using a playbook on its own and putting all the variables in there without any inventories in there. So let's execute. So this is exactly how Ansible will look, but it's not so interesting because there's only one task. And at the moment, it's on the task of deploying NSXT Manager. And if I've said the demo gods are on my side, at the bottom, we're deploying the OVF template. Okay? And as you can see, in the middle, it's there. It's going. That's something else. So I'll let that run in the background. Now, what if I want to use an inventory? I told you that best practice is you don't want to hard code your variables. You want to use an inventory file. So the next demo over here is how you would do that. So this is the part 2 where you have got your NSXT host. So over here it's called Lab1 NSXT Local Manager. And this is my inventory on the right-hand side. That's the group. Within the group, I have the host name, Lab1 NSXT Manager, and the network adapter that it is part of. Okay, the IP, the net mask, the gateway, and the tag. Variables. So if I had multiple NSXT managers, which you would do in production, it has a deployment type of small. So each of the hosts will have small. And the credentials, I'm going to use the same credentials for all 3 NSX managers. And the role is going to be NSX manager. So if you look on the right-hand side, we've got the group defined. I need to specify which vCenter it needs to deploy to. So we've got some variables defined up here above the task of my management vCenter. So that is up here. The way, so with this particular item, so Ansible has some plugins, some lookup modules where you can say, look at the group MP vCenter, and I'm grabbing the first item in that group, which is over here. This particular provides me the host name of the vCenter over here. I'm trying to extract the host variables, and that you'll do host vars brackets with the host name to get me variables. And then using the variables, so vSphere host vars, I can extract the credentials, such as administrator or the data center that it belongs to. We've got OVF path, which says components.filepath. Now let's have a look at where that is. Now I don't see the components under the NSXT manager. However, as I mentioned earlier, NSXT manager is part of an all group. So variables within the all group will have, or lab group, will have the OVF name. So over here is components. Within components, we've got NSXT, and then we've got file name. And that's how I grab my OVF path. Okay. So network info, I'm trying to understand, I'm trying to grab my networks. So we've got network adapters that are assigned to my NSXT manager over here. What this does is doing a loop against the network adapter. So I'm doing a loop because I can have multiple network adapters, for example. I could have a second interface. So it's doing a loop. I'm doing a loop control saying that each network adapter I'm referencing as an NA, a NA, network adapter. And I'm extracting the IP, for example. And I'm extracting the net mask. I'm extracting the gateway, as you can see over here. And I'm setting that as a fact, because this fact I will then later use for my deployment of NSXT Manager. So NSXT Manager, what you can see, and then let me get this on the other side over here to do a comparison. You can see that the vSphere host name I've extracted from above, vSphere username, vSphere password. The inventory hostname short and inventory hostname is something that you can, that Ansible provides with you, right? So anything in the inventory file when you specify, Ansible will automatically provide you with these variables. There's some special variables that Ansible has got. You'll learn that it's quite straightforward. So inventory hostname short means inventory hostname is the full-on FQDN. So lab1 NSXT LMGR1.harrythambi.cloud. What the short means, it detects the domain and it will provide me with lab1 NSXT LMGR-1 as the VM name. Exactly how it is when it's hard-coded over here, as you can see. side by side. The folder is vSphere Data Center, which is represented as MP, and VM lab name. So you can see, I mean, you can literally find ways of not hard coding any of your variables. And this makes this particular piece repeatable, right? So what have I then done? I then have also included this as a role. So on the right-hand side, I've got a folder called roles. And then within roles, I've got a deploy NSX manager tasks and main. Exactly the same. So what has this enabled me to do? So if I go back to my playbook, which is now part 3, I'm only defining the role. So the playbook looks a lot more cleaner now. I've got a title of deploy NSXT appliance, and I've got a role. So if you want to see what that role is doing, you go to the roles folder, and then you look for the folder name called deploy NSXT manager, and then you can see exactly what it's doing. And at the end of it, it's checking if NSX is available, right? So once you deploy it, it takes a while for the services to start. So you can do a URI check, a URI module, which is basically doing a curl. I'm doing a curl to ensure that the status is 200, and I'm giving it some retries of 50 and a delay of 10 seconds, because it takes a while for it to come up, especially vCenters. All right. So that was an example of deploy VMware appliances. The other one is configuring vCenter and ESXi. So you've deployed vCenter, and you can do it the way that I showed you. You can deploy ESXi in a similar fashion, but for me, I'm using nested OVAs provided by William Lamb. And you now need to configure. You need to configure your ESXi host so that you got NTP, all those kind of settings done. You need to then add it to your vCenter. You need to configure your vCenter, such as your distributed switches, your port groups, and so on. So how do we go from there? We've got this playbook. And this is very detailed. I'm not going to go through each line item, but this is to help you understand how a playbook is a set of instructions, right? If you know how to do something manually, you'll be able to write it as an instruction into a playbook. So what do you want to do first of all? You want to configure your vCenter. Here's my play in Ansible, okay? Here are my variables. As I showed you earlier, you can do variables. And these are my repeatable roles. So I want to update vCenter shell. And there's a reason for this. Because so when you deploy a vCenter, for those who are aware, you've got appliance mode and shell mode. Well, I want to go into shell mode because the next task I want to do a get vCenter health check. And that is basically doing get services. And I can quickly show you that. It is fairly simple. So get vCenter health. I'm going to go to my roles folder. And I found you. And go in here. And simply, it's just a one task. And I am doing, effectively, a long bash one-liner. Is doing service control list. And I'm looking for whether the services that I care about have started. And if it hasn't, because I've got a failed when. So failed when if I see anything stopped or start pending, okay? And I'll keep retrying until it's satisfied with the delay, until the service output, the variables that I'm registering, has not failed. So this failed when condition has not failed. And then it will proceed to the next step. The next step being configure vCenter base. So let's have a look at what's inside configure vCenter base. Over here. Simply, I am just adding a vCenter license, and I'm creating a data center. Cool. What's next? Configure vCenter clusters. All right, so I'm not going to go into detail what that is. I'm sure you've all seen configure vCenter clusters. That's basically you're creating a cluster, you're doing HA, you're doing DRS. You're then moving on to creating your VDS, your virtual distributed switches. You're defining how it all looks. So over here, I'm creating my VDS switch. And then moving on to creating my vCenter port groups, okay, which is defined over here. So this is a good one because, as I mentioned earlier, you can have a global variable kind of, in a sense, where you have all the networks defined, and you want to iterate through each network. So what we're doing here, I'm doing a loop of each of my network subnets variable. It's a list of list of a dictionary, and it's going through the name, which switch it's part of, the VLAN, and the trunk, whether it's trunked or not. So we've got some when conditions here. So it's pretty, I mean, so you don't need to create a task for every single port group you have. There are ways you can loop through your variables. It all depends on how you create your and define your layer of your variables. Okay. So moving swiftly on, because I'm running out of time, we've got configure ESXi host for vCenter. We've got ESXi management host, ESXi edge host, etc. And what I'm doing is I am simply configuring the base information, such as NTP and so on. I'm adding the vCenter to the clusters. Okay. Now, there's obviously other steps that you may need, so you can create those roles and add them in. And then we're configuring the ESXi VDS networking. All right. To execute this, and so over here, we would copy this command. So Ansible playbook, we're passing on the inventory of the play, and then we're specifying the playbook. And I'm going to run it at the bottom. And that's it. Off it goes. So in the previous, when I showed you the vCenter earlier on, those ESXi hosts and vCenters had nothing in it. And what this is doing, it's creating the clusters. It's going through. Yellow means something has changed. It's done it because Ansible works in an idempotent way. It checks whether it needs to action it or not. And then green means it's all good, or it's doing some fact gathering, for example. So at the moment, we are adding the ESXi hosts to the clusters. And this will carry on. While that's happening in the background, we've also got the final demo of creating NSX1 segments and gateways, tier 1 gateways. Which is a playbook over here. And it's quite simple, to be honest. You target the NSX manager group. You provide the host name, username, passwords, and then you've got roles such as configuring a DHCP server config. Maybe you want your segments to participate using DHCP server and NSX. You create a tier 1, and then you create the overlay segment. So let's have a quick look at the roles. I'll leave, as you can see on the bottom of the terminal, it's still running the last playbook. So, and let's get the inventory on the right-hand side. All right. So in this one, I am with Ansible. You can do you can have modules that has fact gathering. So you can point it at the NSX team manager in this instance, and you can register the output of the fact gathering so that I can see what edge clusters are there. Okay. Using that Ansible, the edge cluster, the variable, I can do a thing to get the ID, for example, okay? Because that ID is going to become useful to me later when I'm creating a DHCP config. And for those no NSX, I need to specify an edge cluster for that DHCP config. And here we go. Is basically I am using the URI, which is an API method. I am using patch method. So as I mentioned earlier, sometimes the modules that you have are not available. So the best part is that because API is really available, you can just use URI, which is basically API call within Ansible. And again, you can specify all the variables in here, which are extracted from on the right-hand side in my inventory folder. So this is doing a loop on my DHCP configs, and it's creating that. And finally, it's on moving to the creating the, and this is what happens with VS Code when it. So again, you can have policies for creating a tier 1. It's pretty much easily, you can read it really well. You're applying the tier 1 DHCP profile that you created earlier. And moving on to the overlay segments, which is on the right-hand side over here. You're creating the overlay segment that then appears in NSX. It's pretty easy, it's pretty quick, and I'll show you an example where I'll run that command. Again, I'm specifying the inventory and the playbook. First of all, I need to go into my Docker container. Done. So what have I done? I have basically created 2 networks. I'll show you that in a second. It's going to ask me for that. I want to be doing that. So what have I done? So on the networking profiles and DHCP, I've got my VMUG server profile that I just created using it. I've then created a tier 1 gateway, 2 tier 1 gateways for each tenant. And then within the segments, I've created these 2 segments attached to the tier 1 gateways that I mentioned earlier. And denoted by the blue over here, this one tenant has a DHCP profile attached to it, whereas the other one don't. So if you've, the whole point of these demos are to just quickly illustrate, it's a bit hard to explain it all in a 45-minute slot or a 30-minute slot, but the possibilities are endless when it comes to what you can do with Ansible. One example is basically the whole lab, for example, this whole lab here, where I've got all these components. I was able yesterday to destroy, create in 1 hour. And this lab contains 3 ESXi hosts, NSX ALB, an NSXT manager, a vCenter, and 2 VIOS routers, which is also BGP paired with my home network as well. So the possibilities are endless. You can do from an end-to-end deployment. Obviously, for certain use cases, such as AVI migration, you can use it there. Not everyone needs to want to do a home lab, but in your environment, you might want to deploy things and focus on how to improve your infrastructure rather than clicking UIs all the time. Okay. If you've got any questions about Ansible, there's a lot to cover. As you can see, I had to skip a lot. You can reach out to me on my Twitter or LinkedIn. I am going to be providing a blog on how to get the container that's already pre-configured for you, and upload some of these demos for you to then play around at home. Thank you.